Sarina, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarina Sahetya from Johns Hopkins. I'm part of the practical platform as well. Let's go ahead and give a warm welcome to today's presenters who are speaking on collaborations with other platform trials. We have Alistair, Danny, and Srin, who are all members of REMAP-CAP. Danny is also part of the PANTHER trial team. And later in the session, we have Bijan, who will share his experience as an early career researcher within the practical platform. Just to tell you a little bit about our presenters. So Srin Murthy is an investigator at BC Children's Hospital and a clinical associate professor at the University of British Columbia. His work focuses on innovative clinical trials and international collaborations, particularly in managing severe infections and critically ill patients in under-resourced settings. Alistair Nichol is the chair of critical care medicine at the University of College, Dublin, and the director of the Irish Critical Care Trials Network and a consultant at St. Vincent's University Hospital in Dublin. And his academic interests include pandemic preparedness, cardiac arrest, trauma, and mechanical ventilation. Danny McAuley is a consultant and professor in intensive care medicine at the Royal Victoria Hospital and Queen's University of Belfast. He's also a program director for the MRC and NIHR Efficacy and Mechanism Evaluation Program with a research focus on precision medicine in ARDS. And finally, last but not least, Bijan Teja is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, specializing in anesthesiology, and critical care at St. Michael's Hospital. And his research includes steroids and vasopressors in critically ill patients. In 2024, he proposed the FLUDRA-1 study on fludrocortisone in acute respiratory failure, which was endorsed by the practical platform. And we're really lucky that he'll share a little bit about his study as well as his early career research experience later today. Why don't we go ahead and get started?
Thank you very much.
Hey, I'll go first, I guess. Good to see everybody, and it's great to be here. Great to see so many old friends and colleagues on the screen. I have a few slides, and then we'll hand off to Danielle and Bijan, and then I'm sure we'll have some time for open conversation and other things afterwards. I've attended a handful of these webinars, and I know that REMAP-CAP has already been discussed in various fora and various angles. I'll take more of a how we've collaborated with other trials approach and other platform trials specifically to talk about some of the mechanics of that, but also give an introduction to it overall. So as folks know, or can see, REMAP-CAP is a randomized embedded multifactorial adaptive platform trial of community-acquired pneumonia. We've been recruiting since 2016, I guess, in various iterations. And so we have been sort of doing this platform trial thing for some time, and have learned a lot of lessons over the course of that decade. Next slide.
The always frightened squeaker of the house.
Overall, and so as a pandemic preparedness trial, I'm sorry, there's some background noise somewhere. As a platform trial that aims to solve and address future pandemics, and this is a slide that we've been showing in various fora for the past, I think, 15 years now, where column A is the current response to severe outbreaks, where there's a large spike in cases, various waves, and the research response, which is that late breaking curve, comes only at the end. And as we all know, what we want is to embed that research as much as possible into the outbreak itself and the outbreak response, mitigating the impact of those waves of the outbreak, ideally the first wave of the outbreak. And going into COVID-related research and all of the ecosystems and infrastructures that went into COVID is probably beyond the scope of this talk right now, but just sort of framing REMAP-CAP in that world. Next slide. And so in January, we were sort of getting off the ground, 56 sites, 13 countries. The joke was largely we had more study investigators than we had patients, as we were sort of setting up all of the infrastructure to respond to a future pandemic. Next slide. And then over the course of the next few years, we've activated in some way, shape, or form over 400 sites across every continent in over 30 countries, which has been a labor of love by many, many people around the world, many of whom are on this call. And so I want to thank everybody for all of the work on this platform. It's been a lot. Next. These are our reports of randomized trials. There's a number of secondary reports that also emerged over the course of the past few years. And these are our primary reports. We have new reports coming soon on various aspects of COVID-19 and community-acquired pneumonia in the coming months. So stay tuned for those. Next. But I want to focus mostly on sort of the topic and theme here at this talk, which is sort of federating and collaborating with other platform trials. And I know that this was spoken about at a previous webinar. I'm going to go into some of the mechanics of how that happened. And specifically, we did that across 3 reports in 2 large domains, which is the anticoagulation approach and the vitamin C randomized trial. The anticoagulation, we collaborated with the ATTACK investigators and the active 4A investigators. And the intravenous vitamin C collaboration, we collaborated with REMAP and the LOVEIT investigators. It didn't hurt that many of the investigators were largely the same across all of those platforms that we collaborated with, which makes obviously the synergies much nicer. The infrastructures were different. The ecosystems of how we recruited the trials were different, but upfront and as quickly as possible, we harmonized the protocol. And harmonize the protocol largely means making sure that the interventions and the outcomes assessed were as similar as possible. And if those 2 things are in place, a lot of the other differences can largely be ironed out. Next. And so we have in our new core protocol sort of a framework for how these federations work. As a Star Trek nerd myself, this is a larger federation where there's various aspects as to how federated different platforms can be. There can be a complete federation, a tight federation, or a loose federation. And we've taken different approaches to different previous approaches, like the ATTACK active REMAP anticoagulation or the vitamin C one, and ongoing federations that we're doing for our active domains. For a complete federation, the governance is shared, entirely shared with one shared trial steering committee and a single DSMB, and identical protocol documents. These are largely the same clinical trial, but just may have different sponsors across this one clinical trial. In some ways, the entire REMAP-CAP infrastructure with its multiple sponsors is an example of a complete federation. A tight federation has separate trial steering committees, a shared or meta DSMB, and multiple sponsors. And this is similar to what we performed in the vitamin C or ATTACK or anticoagulation federation, where there's a combined analysis using a single statistical model. And ideally, that's one model that may or may not be separate from each trial's primary statistical model. And the last example is sort of a loose federation, where there's separate trial steering committees, separate DSMBs, multiple sponsors, separate protocol documents. And these have to be very, very carefully organized so everything is as much as possible aligned so that the analyses, which would be in theory separate and then prospectively defined combining of them, that they need to be defined the same way in terms of each of the variables, in terms of each of the interventions have to be exactly the same as much as possible, and the outcome assessment needs to be performed in a similar way. And with all of that in place, it could work from a loose federation. We found that it's a bit more tricky and a bit more cumbersome to do it in a thoughtful way, although it does lead more flexibility with individual trials and platforms. Next. And I just want to highlight some of the E part of the REMAP-CAP acronym and how that sort of impacts how we sort of federate. We've reported how we've embedded the trial across different health systems in, say, Pittsburgh, Japan, and South Asia. And given that E is different in various ways in terms of how the system is embedded within routine healthcare, that does lead to challenges across different platform trials as to how that data is extracted and how that data is collectively analyzed. Not necessarily a deal breaker, but something to consider as we aim to embed more and more clinical trials into routine clinical care. I think that's all my slides, and I hand it over to my colleague in Panther, I believe, Danny. Oh yeah, of course, this is my email address and my together picture, making sure that we all work together in all of these complicated initiatives. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Srin. So likewise, it's great to have the opportunity to present here and see all the new and familiar faces as well. So I'd like to present on the Panther, which I think has had the huge advantage of coming after REMAP-CAP and learning from that huge effort that we've done to date. I guess if we look globally at what we achieved during the pandemic, I think we delivered brilliantly in the phase 3 space, the large pragmatic clinical trials. But I think perhaps in the phase 2 space, we were less successful, and particularly in the UK, it was a bit like the Wild West, with a lot of phase 2 trials competing rather than collaborating, as has been the ethos of the REMAP-CAP team and many others. So I guess that was the reason for trying to bring together a bunch of people to do phase 2 with an eye on pandemic preparedness, but also in ARDS and precision medicine. And we recognized also that we have done a lot of trials that have shown no difference, and part of that is probably related to the heterogeneity. So essentially, Panther is a precision medicine adaptive network platform trial in hypoxic acute respiratory failure. So that's the convoluted sort of way in which we ended up with the acronym Panther. But if we jump to the next slide, the pathway to Panther is summarized here, and it's about probably 10 to 15 years worth of work by many other people, including Carolyn Calfee, and I'll just summarize, and Lua Boss, for example, both of whom are central to the delivery of Panther. And I'll just summarize. Essentially, we recognize heterogeneity of treatment of the population, that was identified by Carolyn as there being sub-phenotypes within the overall syndrome. Those sub-phenotypes, importantly, had heterogeneity of treatment effect to various treatments, including pharmacological therapy such as simvastatin. There was some mechanistic work to show that underpinning those phenotypes, there was biological processes that seemed to separate the two. And now we've moved to the point where we can potentially measure these phenotypes at the bedside. And that was enabled by two things: work from Pratik Singha and Carolyn Calfee, which showed that rather than needing to do complex clustering techniques to identify these phenotypes, it was possible using a parsimonious number of biomarkers, IL-6, soluble TNFR1, and bicarbonate. It was possible to phenotype patients. And then in some recent work that we've completed, if we move to the next slide, in collaboration with a local diagnostic company, we have been able to show that it is possible to measure IL-6 and soluble TNFR1 at the bedside and combining that with a bicarbonate from a contemporaneous blood gas, and then using that logistic regression equation that was part of the parsimonious model work that I described, it's possible to try and phenotype patients at the bedside in near. And again, whenever we put this together, looking at how successful REMAP-CAP had been, and also the benefits of international trials, we really wanted to focus on an international approach, and I'll come back to that in terms of how we have tried to harmonize across platforms. Our focus was on phase 2, so we wanted to accelerate drug delivery. We know that many phase 3 trials show no difference, and perhaps that's because of this heterogeneity, but also perhaps because we jumped to phase 3 too quickly. As mentioned, it's a precision medicine and it's a platform trial, so we're going to test multiple therapies simultaneously. It's not as complicated as REMAP-CAP because I am not that smart, but we're going to test multiple therapies at the same time for efficiency. And it's going to be open label. And again, we can discuss the pros and cons of that as a methodological approach. But again, this is about accelerating and trying to get to the point where we're backing the winners for therapies that would then be tested in phase 3 in specific phenotypes. A couple of other characteristics that we just want to flag. We have an independent prioritization committee. And we think that's really important. Again, looking to the pandemic, it was a wee bit like the Wild West where we were testing all sorts of random therapies. So we want to make sure that there's a process by which we review the evidence to support coming into the platform. But as well as that being done internally by a prioritization committee that's part of Panther, we have an external committee that reviews and verifies our decisions. Two things are important about platforms in my mind. One is that they go on, hopefully forever, and two is that they need funded forever. And that's why we've really put a huge amount of effort into early career researcher engagement, and I'm glad to see Mary's on the call as well, and might comment as well as Bijan in terms of the potential for early career engagement. If there are any early career researchers on the call who want to get involved, please do drop me or Mary an email. And then in terms of funding, that's the other challenge. We can run these trials on academic funding, I think, in the short term, but to make them sustainable, I think we need to be an attractive proposition for industry as well. And if you think that a phase 2 trial for industry costs about $50 million US, we think we can probably do an equally high quality study, but for a fraction of that value to de-risk drug development for companies that will invest in keeping Panther ongoing. We think the precision medicine approach that we are taking is the most promising at the minute, but we also think it's naive to assume that this is the only phenotyping approaches that will be the answer. So we've moved from ARDS to hyperinflammatory and hypoinflammatory phenotypes, and it's impossible to imagine that there won't be other mechanistic insights that we will be able to get, and hence the need for embedded biobanking. And critically important is with all we do is having the patient and public voice embedded within the trial that Leanne, Hayes and Alistair have been helping us with. And one of the things that we've done, which I think is really novel and interesting, is that we've put together an international public and patient involvement group that covers both Panther, REMAP-CAP and Practical. So we're actually trying to make sure that we've got representation of patients across all of the platforms to work together. And we jump to the next slide. So this is one of my favorite slides, and it's really just a picture to show the collaboration. It shows international collaboration. It shows early and late and middle career researchers. It shows methodologists and clinicians. So I think it really emphasizes the benefits of this collaborative approach that we get. So jump into the next slide for me. So this is our main research question. So in patients with ARDS with hyper or hypoinflammatory phenotypes, randomized to either simvastatin or baricitinib, which are the two initial prioritized interventions, compared to usual care, is there an improvement in 28-day organ support-free days, which is our primary outcome. Just very briefly, the eligibility criteria then are ARDS according to the global definition. We have ambitions to expand beyond ARDS, but for now we're going to focus in ARDS. So we need infiltrates on the chest X-ray, which is a matter of debate. Going forward, we exclude patients who have more than 48 hours from the onset or who are unlikely to survive or in whom they've been previously enrolled in the trial or consent has been declined. And then we've got a specific exclusion criteria based on the intervention. For example, with simvastatin, that excludes patients with high CK or markedly deranged liver function, and baricitinib if they have a particularly low neutrophil count or platelet count has been done in the previous trials of these therapies. So jumping to the next slide. Is just a list of the secondary outcomes, and they're pretty standard outcomes. We're trying to limit the amount of pharmacovigilance that we have to do in terms of adverse event reporting by having predefined safety outcomes. So we have a significant list of safety outcomes that will be collected. The other reason for doing it as a safety outcome rather than as pharmacovigilance is that it's an open label study. And one of the things that happens in an open label study, if you've got a serious adverse event and it's in usual care, that typically is at risk of not getting reported because people know it's open label. Whereas if it happens in the arm with the intervention, then people are more likely to say it's due to the intervention, even if it sometimes isn't. So safety reporting is probably a better way of capturing the risk to patients. We're also interested in longer term outcomes as well, and we're doing some work on that. So this is the slide that summarizes the design. It's a Bayesian adaptive multi-arm design. We're going to test 2 interventions at any one time. There are multiple interim analyses that are pre-planned, and whenever we hit either a trigger for futility or efficacy, a therapy then either drops out and a new one comes in. I'll not go into the details of the triggers, only to say that there is a significant type 1 error allowed for the methodologist in the audience. And the rationale for that is that, again, we're not saying that this is definitely going to be definitively effective, but we want to back the winner. And therefore, we're tolerating the type 1 error because we will subsequently need to prove in a large phase 3 if these therapies work or not. So we jump to the next slide. And this just summarizes the Bayesian sort of assumptions. We expect that it'll take us about approximately 150 patients in each arm and each phenotype, and the time it'll take us to recruit, and the expected sample size is just about 1,000 patients, which should be within the initial period of the grant. Before I finish and hand over to Alistair, I guess we're very keen to sort of collaborate, and the model that we've taken aligns very much with the tight model that Srin described with practical. So we're going to embed Panther as a domain in practical. So practical will be the clinical coordinating center, and then the data will come into Imperial and will be analyzed in a single Bayesian model. So that's the approach that we've taken with practical, and it will hopefully be funded by CHR, and we've submitted a grant for that. In contrast, in other jurisdictions, it'll be a full, complete platform alignment where essentially in the US, for example, we'll have 10 sites, but all of the data will flow directly into Imperial, unlike where in Panther or in Practical it sits within Practical and then gets moved to us. So I guess it just shows the models that Srin described as complete and tight can also be flexible across the platform collaboration, even in different jurisdictions, which I think is quite an interesting approach. With that, I'll hand over to Alistair.
Hi, Danny. Thanks very much for that. My name is Alistair. I'm an intensive care doctor in Dublin, and I'm an investigator in REMAP-CAP, Panther, and Practical. But I'm going to touch on that, but I'm going to pull back for a second and maybe talk a little bit about an endeavour I've had the pleasure to get involved with John Marshall on behalf of InFact and with Laura Merson on behalf of ISARIC. And again, I thank John for some of the slides I'm going to use today. So next slide, please. So, Danny and Srin have made the case that platform trials have been proven to be really effective in the acute care research that we do. We can even see by some of the examples brought up, even with these relatively new designs, they do lead themselves to collaboration. And we're very lucky in our area of research in ICU. Collaboration is the rule rather than the exception. But there are loads of opportunities that this potentially offers us as a community engaged in platform trials, and even those who are thinking of setting up platform trials in the future. Next slide, please. So I suppose the whole thing is when we start to pull back from even the specifics of the trial and is to think about, well, how might we work together, and how might, and Srin's touched on some of this, but there is a long continuum from, a little to a lot about how we might align ourselves across a lot of these things, clinical problems, which we'll come back to in a second, the coordinating activities at sites, so not just the delivery of the trial, a lot of the other stuff that goes into this, the huge amount of data that is collected and where is it stored, and how might we, with different platforms collecting data on the same individuals, share this data and reduce the burden at sites. But also, I think this is what's going to be an ongoing issue, is sustaining and developing these platforms. I think any of us that have been involved in trials for a long time, the disheartening effect of spending many years setting up a trial only to dismantle it and start off again, see a huge advantage of platforms that we can avoid a whole load of that wasted work. Next slide, please. So, and again, this is a slide that John kind of gave me. So looking at the sort of the average ICU patient, next slide, please. There are lots of areas that we can look at. The last two studies have, well, sort of focused on ARDS. Next slide, please. But as we start to telescope out, we can see acute hypoxic respiratory failure for Practical. And next slide, please. Again, the majority of REMAP-CAP patients were recruited during the huge surge in COVID-19. Next slide, please. But there's many other issues. There's a huge overlap with sepsis, and there are a number of emerging sepsis platforms being put together. Next slide, please. And again, at risk or acutely ill patients. And I think many of us are aware of a large number of platforms being put together. So these diagrams or Venn diagrams, there's going to be a huge amount of overlap. And there's going to be a huge challenge or a huge opportunity for us as a community to work together. And I mean, and Srin sort of talked about this in tight or loose, but even just pulling back is with InFact or ISARIC or our broader collaborations, so we can understand what's going on. So we can all agree that we want to at least coordinate, ideally collaborate, and possibly federate when it's appropriate. Next slide, please. I mean, I think it'll be apparent to everyone, even after the last two talks, that there's a huge opportunity to increase the efficiency of what we do, and that's useful for applying for funding. To minimize conflict, which is increasingly important these days, but we can see even that on a trial by trial basis, if we come up with sort of rules that sort of guide us, that is only beneficial. Unfortunately, bird flu keeps motoring on in the background, and I think it's incumbent of all of us to think how we might pivot in the future, and again, to be sustainable. And next slide, please. And again, a huge amount of gratitude to John for starting to put this work together. There was a colloquium he held in Toronto in 2023, where a number of us got together and started talking about this. It was followed up by a meeting in Dublin in September of last year, which was actually also joined by the WHO Respiratory Support Programme. And we plan again to have an InFact meeting on Tuesday the 10th in the morning at Critical Care Reviews in Belfast in 2025, and a SARIC/InFact meeting in Rwanda in October in 2025. So these efforts for all of us working in platforms to work together more and more for the benefit of our patients, our community, and the success of our trials is ongoing. And again, on behalf of John and Laura, if other people are interested, just reach out about any of these. Next slide, please. I tell you what, I was going to delve into some specific examples, but just very, very briefly, Panther Practical and REMAP-CAP have a very tight collaboration with public patient research. Next slide, please. But there is a huge opportunity to do this in biological samples. And we have done that as a tight collaboration between Panther Practical and REMAP, where we've agreed to collect the same. Methodology opens a huge other opportunity. Next slide, please. And again, I'll skip this one for now. Next slide, please. And Danny's actually covered a lot of this about severity and precision. It's a huge bit to collaborate on. Next slide, please. But again, Danny's slightly covered this, is we need to use these platforms not just to work together to coordinate, collaborate, federate, but for our early career researchers, how we apply our research into findings at the bedside, and how actually we integrate our networks more closely. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to use these endeavors to become much tighter as a whole community. And next, I think, final slide. So again, the world is moving on despite us. We need to be ready to do these things again. And hopefully these trials, platforms, and collaborations are the way to do it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. So I'll be brief because I want to leave time for questions. But you know, I'm an early career researcher, and I've had some early funding for the Fludro-1 trial, which is looking at fludrocortisone in acute hypoxic respiratory failure with airspace disease. And I'll just talk a little bit about you know, just 2 minutes about the trial, but then sort of my experience as an early career researcher working with multiple platforms, which I think, you know, hopefully will be helpful for others here. So next slide. Just some funding acknowledgements. Next slide. So Fludro-1 is sort of come up in the last couple of years, and it's a trial across multiple platforms, or practical, REMAP-CAP, and ATTACK-CAP, looking at fludrocortisone versus usual care for adults over 18 years with acute hypoxic respiratory failure or CAP enrolled on those platforms. And at this point, we're just looking at feasibility and collecting secondary outcome data as part of an internal pilot. Next slide. So, you know, briefly, all this came up think in 2018, when the two big trials on corticosteroids and septic shock were published in the New England Journal, I was just going to give hydrocortisone to my patient. I was rounding with Neil Ferguson in the ICU, and he said, you know, Bijan, if you're going to give steroids and septic shock, you should just give the regimen in the trial that suggested a benefit. So I thought, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. Why not use fludrocortisone? And so we've subsequently done a Bayesian network meta-analysis where we looked at the 17 RCTs and found that addition of fludrocortisone conferred a 3.8% absolute mortality benefit in septic shock with a 94% probability of superiority. That goes up to 97% with the fludrest that was just published. And interestingly, over 90% of the patients that were in the two trials that tested fludrocortisone and hydrocortisone were mechanically ventilated at the time of enrollment. And then we repeated this analysis as a target trial emulation in the Premier database, and we found almost the exact same result of 3.7% absolute risk reduction for mortality or discharge to hospice. Approaches just published sort of a secondary analysis suggesting that the benefit of fludrocortisone and hydrocortisone was greatest in CAP, and we sort of did a subsequent secondary analysis for our target trial showing that the benefit of fludrocortisone seemed to be the same in patients with or without pneumonia on admission. And there's many sort of possible mechanisms for this. Next slide. Sometimes people ask, doesn't hydrocortisone have enough mineralocorticoid activity? But those equivalencies are based on salt retention in the kidney. And fludrocortisone has many other effects. It would be like comparing milrinone and epinephrine based on heart rate response. Like they're two completely different drugs that work on different receptors. And in fact, hydrocortisone is cleaved on the mineralocorticoid receptor and causes salt retention through another mechanism. And so I think, I've been very interested to look at this in hypoxic respiratory failure. Next slide. And so this has been examined in one head-to-head comparison too, but really one larger one. In the Coit study, it was a 2x2 factorial, and they had 500 patients, and there was a 3.3% absolute difference, but it was underpowered to detect that fact. In fact, they said it was a secondary objective and not taken into account in the sample size calculation. And you would need a sample size of about 5,000 patients to detect that with 80% power. Next slide. So, I presented this at the CCT-TG in 2022, and I said, I'm an early career investigator. I want to do this trial that eventually will, have sort of 5,000 patients. And, I think appropriately people said, are you sure you want to take this on like early in your career? Because I don't know how feasible that is. And I sort of left the stage a little dejected, and then I walked past John Marshall's table. He said, Bijan, like, I actually think you can do this. Like, don't give up. I'm excited about this idea. I mean, he admitted then it was sort of less about fludrocortisone and more about getting the platforms sort of an opportunity to work together, which I think is sort of good for research in the field. And so we started submitting grant applications. Next slide. The first one to the IRS, International Anesthesia Research Society, was rejected. But I have to say, like, as an early career researcher, the best part of working with multiple platforms has been all the feedback that I get. Like when I send out a draft grant, it comes back to me like fully read from sort of multiple people with lots of comments. And, I've talked to colleagues of mine who just say, I send it out and I sort of get crickets and I just submit it as is. So we submitted this the first year, it didn't work. The next slide. But then we, based on the feedback I got, I basically completely changed the grant. And the second year we were successful. I think there's like 100 to 150 applicants and 4 are selected. There's no way I would have been able to get this award without sort of multiple, because you get all the platform leads on these multiple perspectives, lots of really good feedback and sort of thinking through the methods in a way that I sort of never could have otherwise. And so, this has now been funded for $174,000 US. And we have Health Canada, a no objection letter, and also REB approval, at least from Clinical Trials Ontario. Next slide. And so interestingly, IRS considered the multi-platform approach a great strength. I mean, they're very interested in sort of novelty of concepts. And so a lot of the feedback was, this is fantastic, it's novel, it's highly pragmatic. And next slide. But of course, this is seed funding. And so I'm applying for other funding. And interestingly, I applied to PSI, which is like an Ontario-based funder. And they said, it's hard to see like why this would increase statistical or logistical efficiency, and why would an early career researcher want to sort of, work with 3 platforms simultaneously. So you get feedback either way, and we'll be resubmitting this. And next slide. And then I've just submitted my first CIHR to it, essentially, taking all that feedback into account to say, look, our initial seed funding is on Practical as the lead platform, and can we, get another $700,000 to add patients from REMAP and sort of work on how we work together across the 2 platforms. And again, really, really helpful feedback. That the final submission I put in looks nothing like the initial draft I sent out, and so I'm very grateful for that. And hopefully, either this round or in a subsequent round, we'll get this funded. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters. That was really incredible to hear about all the efforts on your platforms and collaborating across them. We'll open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand or speak up. Bijan, I think Brian Cuthbertson said, I think he was the one who told you to get off stage.
Yeah, something like that.
Art?
So great, interesting presentations, everyone. I focused a question, I guess, for everyone, but maybe a little more at Danny and maybe even Sarina, and that's the funding issue is clearly a big one to keep this platform going. So 2 questions related to what are you going to do, Sarina? What are the Americans going to do? Clearly, there's a difficult times in the U.S., and it's not really a joke, right? This is pretty serious. And one approach that Danny talked about was industrial funding from industry. So how's that actually going to work, Danny? Does the industry do the trial? Do they have control? How is the control issues? How is this actually managed, I guess?
So it's a good question, Art, and I guess the honest answer is we're sort of working through it as we speak. So we have an annual industry symposium where we invite small and large companies to come along, and we sort of try and first of all build the relationships. So that I think is pretty important. And we've had a mix of success. The small pharma, just want you to take their drug and do it for them without having any funding available, and they're happy to give you complete control because they can't do it. Whereas the bigger pharma, which obviously have the funding available, are much more keen to keep control. We're pretty far on in discussions with one company, and I'll not say who it is just in case I sort of cause it to all go wrong. But they have seen the benefit. So it's a company that has a drug for another indication, pretty big pharma company, and they're basically looking to expand what they call their life cycle. So they're not that interested in ARDS, but they think their drug might have a role in ARDS. And therefore, the person that I'm talking with said, you know what, 5 million, we don't even have to ask for permission. So it doesn't even have to go to the sort of chief exec. If it's above 5 million, that's different. So they're looking at our processes. They've been involved in looking, they've met with our methods group. They've met with our database group. They've met with the me and biobanking questions, and that they see that there is an opportunity here that they can do a study at a tenth of what they might normally do for a phase 2, and it massively de-risks then them going into phase 3, where they would retain full control. So the pitch is you have to give up some control at phase 2, but then you can take back full control at phase 3. And the term that the company's using is they're taking a smart risk. That's their sort of byline. So we'll see where it lands. If we can get one company in, I think it'll change the whole deal. And that's the experience that I Spy had with breast cancer. You know, that they got the first company in, they had a success, and then now companies are falling over themselves for the fear of missing out. So that was Laura Esserman's sort of advice. So I guess that's where we are, and I'll keep you posted if we can get it over the line.
And sorry, just curious about how you're going to. They're going to sop up all the patients potentially, right? How do you keep patients for the academic trials?
Yeah, so the deal is that they buy into Panther, and their intervention becomes one of the 3 interventions, usual care. So they might jump other prioritized interventions, but they can't, you know, we're not going to stop doing, if we're running simvastatin and Barry, you know, they'll have to go into the queue, or if we haven't started Barry, they'll jump Barry, for example, or simvastatin. So I think it's part of it. It maybe helps. I mean, there are a lot of other platforms that you may be aware of. There's one called, you know, Breathe Easier that has been funded by BARDA that, you know, is testing anti-VEGF, TLR4 antagonist and complement inhibitor. And they're being done by a CRO who don't really have ARDS experience. So I think that's the other attraction. You know, you come to Panther, you get that bunch of people that I showed on the slide helping you do your trial. So I think we'll hopefully not compete against the other trials.
Great. I'm going to sidestep the U.S. funding question because I think the answer is we don't know what the future holds in the U.S. You know, the pharmaceutical collaboration is really fantastic, but limited when you're talking about ICU interventions that don't involve novel pharmacologic agents, right? Whether it's a ventilator strategy or hydrocortisone versus fludrocortisone. Probably harder to get pharma buy-in or foundational buy-in for those types of strategies. That's where government investment has been so crucial. And we hope it continues. Certainly the funding so far has come through, certainly with the Panther USA has come through in the current climate, and drive seems to be ongoing and not currently jeopardized. And so we are keeping our heads down and trying to do good work and hoping that paves the way for us for right now.
And Sarina, I think that's a really good point. The industry funding has to be more than the amount that it takes just to do the industry. Sure. It has to have an overhead that's not ridiculous, but allows us to do the other stuff that industry's not interested in, for sure.
Any other questions? Mary?
Hi, I'm Mary Smith from Amsterdam, working with Danny and colleagues on the Panther trial. I had a question for Bijan. Excellent presentation as an early career member too. What for advice would you have for new early career members who want to be involved in a platform trial?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things that I've found is, you know, it's you sort of have to get prioritization on these trials. So I think, you know, if there's an area that you're interested in, like, you know, with fludrocortisone, for example, it started with a a network meta-analysis and an observational trial. And I think if there's sort of an area you're interested in, see if you can at least get involved in some of that background work first. And then, for me, it was going to our trials group next and sort of presenting the idea. And they have, for example, in Canada, they have a critical care trials group where you can have sort of a protocol development session. And there, many of the senior leaders or senior researchers will come and sort of give you good feedback to tailor your approach and sort of let you know, oh, hey, you're missing a survey or you're missing sort of this type of piece to get something like this that you want prioritized on a platform. And then once you have that and once all that is ready, I think you can come to a platform, or in my case, multiple platforms, as sort of John's helped me do, and go to their prioritization committees. And once you've achieved prioritization on a platform, I think that's when you really get sort of buy-in from the platforms, and they support you and they give you, for me, it's just been game changing, like how much support I got for the CIHR application and the REB. And like, once you have the funding, they really help you take off.
Danny?
Could I maybe just develop that with Mari and Bijan? What are the risks? I mean, you and Mari maybe were linked in and therefore had access to the platform. One of the worries that I think some of us have is that these platforms can become a bit of a closed shop. That hasn't been our experience with REMAP-CAP either, or practical. But how do we get people who aren't connected into the platform to make sure that it's not a closed opportunity?
Good question. From my perspective, or was that to the group?
To you and Mari, maybe initially.
I guess for me, it's because people, part of it too, like I haven't mentioned, but David Mazer, who has run the TRIX3 and TRIX4 trial and has done really large trials. He's my mentor on the IRS grant, and he's like our research director for the department, for example, has said, Bijan, like his job is to make sure that you don't just sort of get lost in the shuffle, and that he's kind of a senior guy who can advocate for you and help you sort of navigate the different platforms and all the relationships that you are going to want to maintain. And so I guess maybe in addition to sort of having the platforms, it does help to have one or two sort of designated people who help you, who know the ecosystem and maybe are sort of within your department and helping you navigate that. But I guess for people, for sort of bringing people in, it's harder if they don't have that linkage, for sure.
Yeah, in our early career research group, we also stated that it's very important that also people from outside can join platform trials, not only if you have a mentor who is very successful within it. And I think maybe opportunities like joining these webinars, so you can learn a lot from platform trials and also see who's involved, that if you have a very interesting idea, that you know who to reach out to. So I think it's important to make sure that people are aware that these webinars and initiatives are organized. So it's easier to step in, even if you don't have a mentor.
Srin, you want to weigh in also?
Sure, and I think this is a fundamental question that all of us in the platform trials and outside the platform trials community are struggling with and need to sort of think very thoughtfully about. We aim to be perpetual, we aim to be inclusive, but the perception is that it's a closed shop, and a lot of senior people getting lots of sort of senior stuff happening. And so I think for all of us on this call who are sort of established, to make sure that we always think about these issues, because sustainability and perpetualness is sort of the theme of platform trials more broadly. Not a question, more of a final plea to everyone on this call to always think about these things.
Okay. Any additional questions? I think we might have time for one more. If not, then I'll let us wrap up and say a huge thank you to our presenters and for every one of you who joined us on this call, on this webinar. And I know we will have more webinars coming soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.